Welcome everybody to this first mini lecture for POL 130, where I am going to be talking about what comparative politics is. First, a little bit of an overview about politics and political science, right? So politics basically is how people decide who is supposed to get what and when and how much. Right? So politics is the process by which people in communities of various sizes, from maybe neighborhood associations, community associations, right, condo associations, all the way up to local governments and then state governments and federal governments and even international organizations, how they make collective decisions about who is supposed to get what. And political science is the systematic and empirical study of politics. So by empirical, we mean that we are describing the way that the world is, and we're trying to understand things about it, as opposed to making normative claims or saying this is how we think the world should be, right? So we're really using data and observations to try to understand how politics happens. And politics involves power, right? It involves these three dimensions of power, which I will mention in another mini lecture for this week. So what is comparative politics? Comparative politics is one of the main subfields of political science. There are four main subfields of political science, and here is how you can understand them. So American politics is basically the politics of one country. If we were in France, we would call this French politics. If we were in Sri Lanka, we would call this Sri Lankan politics. You get the picture, right? Comparative politics, we're looking at the politics that take place within countries, but we're looking at all countries around the world to try to understand how, for example, all types of presidential democracies interact with their citizens, or all types of electoral autocracies, how they use repression, right? International relations is the politics between countries. So we're not looking at what happens within countries, either with one case study or across many case studies, but we're looking at how countries interact with each other on the international stage. And then political theory focuses on those kind of main important questions about who is supposed to get what, i.e. what is politics, right? So what is a state, what are democracy, what are justice, what's equality, etc. So here's an example, right, of how American comparative and international relations would address the same question. So we might be interested in how countries responded to the pandemic, right? If we were looking at this from an American politics perspective, we might compare different presidential administrations, for example. Alternatively, we might compare different states. So what was Wisconsin's response in comparison to, say, Maryland's or Connecticut's or Colorado's, right? Or how did local governments respond? And maybe we're thinking what we want to measure is how effective were responses, or mortality rates, for example, right? If we were looking at the same question, how did countries or how did different entities respond to the pandemic? From a comparative politics perspective, we might say, okay, well, we can sort the world into, say, for example, two types of countries. We have countries that are democratic, and we will in a few weeks define that in a very specific way. And we are countries that are not democratic. So how did countries that are democracies differ in their responses to countries that are autocracies or dictatorships, right? Or if we're looking at democracies in general, there's different ways of categorizing them. One way is by executive legislative systems, which we are going to learn about also in this class. So we might compare how presidential, which is the US, parliamentary, which is the UK, and semi-presidential, which is France, how these types of democratic systems responded to the pandemic. And if we were approaching this from an IR perspective, we might look at things like, well, how did the World Health Organization respond to the pandemic versus how did the European Union respond? All right, so one thing that I am going to have you do this week, based on this little mini lecture, is to go to this Microsoft form. At this form, you're going to see screenshots of tables of contents of 3 different textbooks, right? One is an American politics textbook, one is an IR textbook, and one is a comparative politics textbook. And what I'm going to ask you to do is to read the tables of contents and try to figure out which is which. And the reason why I'm having you do this is just to get a better sense of the difference in particular between comparative and IR. So I was a poli-sci major when I was an undergrad, and I will tell you, I did not know what the difference was between them initially before I took both comparative and IR classes, because they sound quite confusing, right? They're both comparing international things. So through this activity with looking at the textbooks, I want you to really see and try to understand the differences between them. And that is it for this mini lecture, everybody.